So I hope our guests are starting to join us. One of the things that we are experiencing is some technical difficulty. Hi, good evening. I'm Yvonne Brannon, and I'm very sorry to tell you that we can't figure out how to get our webcams to work. So we're at a crossroads. We're trying to decide if we should move forward with the webinar tonight or if we should reschedule this and see if we can work out the technical difficulties and figure out what's going on. I wonder if anybody has any thoughts. We have our guests who joined us now, a lot of them. If you would want to put something in the chat box, do you have some suggestions or opinions for us? We would, we really want to, we can show our PowerPoints and talk. You just can't see anybody. Anybody have, any of our guests have an opinion? You can type it right in there in the chat box. Or raise your hand. So I'm not being
2 votes to reschedule and 2 to keep going, 3 to keep going.
okay. Are the rest of you, anybody else really want to try? We have never had this happen before. We've probably done 100 webinars this year, and we cannot figure it out right now to save us. And I hate to hang up because I'm afraid if I hang up and restart the meeting that we will have big trouble. So it sounds like the majority wants to move on.
Sounds like it. And I do see a way I can pass over the screen share to Angela, I believe. So
Yes.
I can try that when you're ready.
Okay, so guys, we are really literally flying blind here. We won't be able to see the beautiful face of our presenters tonight and their beautiful souls that shine through. But we are tonight here to talk about fathers and trauma and how using children's literature to address ACEs. I'm sure that the folks that are joining us are already fairly familiar with the concept of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I hope that you are, and I hope that you joined us on other webinars where Terrance and I, Dr. Ruth, who's also on the line.
Hey, everyone.
Say hello, Terrance.
Hey, everyone.
So Dr. Ruth and I have been spending a lot of time the last couple of years talking about adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And we met these two professors at NC State and became very intrigued with their work, Dr. Qiana Cryer-Coupet and Dr. Angela Wiseman. So I'll take just a second to, and really important now to show you their photographs because you can't see them, and to let you know a little bit about Qiana. She is a professor of social work at NC State University. Dr. Ruth and works in the same department, teaching in social work. She has a program of research that has focused on parenting practices and looking at how that impacts family health and well-being across the lifespan of children and families. Her current research explores the experiences and needs of non-resident fathers with children living in formal and informal kinship care. She is the co-PI of the Black Families Project. It's a national survey of over 1,000 Black adolescents and their primary caregivers. As I mentioned earlier, she is a professor and she teaches human behavior and social environment, research methods, and program evaluation in the Masters of Social Work program. Joining us also tonight is Dr. Angela Wiseman. She's Associate Professor of Literacy Education at NC State University. As a former elementary school teacher and literacy specialist, her work is centered around researching, teaching, and preparing teachers to work with children in grades K through 8 and their families. She has been implementing a family literacy program in a residential treatment facility since 2015, and she uses a trauma-informed approach for mothers and fathers who have experienced homelessness, incarceration, and substance abuse. We are really honored to have these scholars with us tonight to share with us all their research as well as their varied experiences. And I think that the best thing for me to do now, if you would, Angela, I'm going to let you take the control here and share your presentation that you and Qiana have prepared. So just give us a second to make that happen.
That sounds great. I'm ready when you are.
Angela, I just handed it over to you. Are you able to share your screen now?
Show my screen. And then are you
Yes.
seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. Well, let me get it started from the beginning, and Qiana and I can get started now. So it's showing you. Let me actually see if I can.
Play from start. Yeah.
Swap those, yeah.
Let's see. How do I do that where I can switch it to the other?
Up in the top left corner, if you hit swap displays.
Oh, that's better. Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you everybody for joining us today. My colleague Qiana Cryer-Coupet and I are looking forward to having time to talk about our program that focuses on fathers and trauma and incorporates children's literature to address ACEs. So to actually start off, I think Qiana will tell our story, kind of how we got started with this group. You can see both some of our community partners and our students that work with us on this project and some of the books that we use. Like I said, and Yvonne introduced that I am a professor of literacy education, and I've worked, my focus is using children's literature to discuss critical social issues, and it's usually with children, but I developed community partnerships about 5 years ago, and we found that we were having conversations about literacy and using children's picture books in families and communities, and we found that there was a real need at this residential treatment facility to implement a family literacy program that where the mothers and fathers had the opportunity to focus on their experiences and their treatment, and also being separated from their children, and even thinking about how to use books to do that. And so I started working with a community partner and implementing a family literacy program. And what an interesting thing happened a couple of years ago. A friend of mine who was actually taking a class of Qiana's said, I think you need to meet my professor because she is doing interesting work kind of like you are. And I think you would have a lot to talk about. And we get together and meet, and it turns out we're actually working with some of the same fathers. And they had actually told me about her because she had been interviewing and working with them, and they had talked to her about reading picture books with me. So actually, Qiana, want to turn that over to you to see, is there anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, so I would say, again, the student came to say, I think you all are doing similar work. And so at the time I was working in the facility, interviewing fathers, non-resident fathers who had issues with experiencing homelessness, substance use disorder, and prior stints with incarceration. And so it was very promising to hear that they were also working with another NC State professor. And many of the dads were surprised that I didn't know that we were working at the same university. We didn't know one another. And so, again, as Angela said, we sat down over tacos to kind of talk about the intersections that we saw within our work. And so as we began to work together, some of the modifications that I was able to add to the literacy intervention that she had already begun was to really start to think about, well, what could social work contribute in this literacy space? And so thinking of ways that psychosocial education could be utilized to help the fathers after they were done reading the text to kind of think about what would be the next steps in terms of implementing some of the social skills with their children and with the children's caregivers. And so we've done 3 groups together with fathers so far, and 1 semester we spent with mothers. So that's where we are.
And one thing I'd like to say is that I feel incredibly fortunate and all to work with Qiana, but also coming from an education standpoint, I'm a former teacher and currently a teacher educator. Qiana works with social workers, and the one thing that we realized is that this interdisciplinary approach is key to us implementing and developing a successful trauma-informed program. Bottom line, I couldn't do it without her. And we also think that this carries over to how we approach working with teachers and social workers. So one thing is with the audience here today, I'm not sure what your background is, but one of the most important things we've learned together is how important it is to take an interdisciplinary approach in our work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've also begun to think about, and we hosted a workshop this semester prior to our COVID suspensions. We had about 25 social workers and social work students and education students, where we began to kind of talk about, well, what are our definitions of trauma? What are our individual scopes of practice, thinking from the lens of social work and education, and how can we best work together? So I guess next slide. So as we think about this idea of trauma-informed work with fathers, we are starting from the lens that has been laid out by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And so this group defines family trauma in particular as frightening, often life-threatening and violent events that can happen to any or all family members. It causes a traumatic stress response in the family members that can ripple throughout the family for several generations. But most importantly, in some ways, it can impede optimal family functioning. And so particularly as we think about fathers in the context of those who are experiencing homelessness, experiencing the sequelae of substance use disorders, as well as those who've been impacted by the criminal justice system, those are all very frightening, often life-threatening and violent events that cause fathers to have to now parent separated from their children as a result of those events. And so we wanted to start off today's talk kind of giving you all a framework of how we define or how we see family trauma in the context of our work. Next slide. And so as we think about this overarching framework, you know that many of you are probably familiar with the adverse childhood experiences framework. And so if you were to look on the left side of the screen, for those who are not familiar, we know that as we think about the ways in which scholars and the government look at ACEs, there are 3 categories that are traditionally been looked at in terms of ACEs. And so we have that abuse category where we see physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. We also see that neglect is often measured. So in terms of kind of thinking about that emotional neglect or attachment that a child might have with its parents or caregivers, and also kind of thinking about physical neglect. How might that impact a child's later outcomes? Household dysfunction is the last category that's often looked at, and so that would be categorized as a child having a caregiver who suffers from some mental health disorder, or having an adult household member who has been incarcerated or has a substance use disorder, witnessing domestic violence in the home, or living in a household that is absent of both biological parents. We often know that there are modifications to the ways in which folks are starting to look at ACEs, really kind of thinking about also issues with homelessness, as well as victimization, cyber victimization, or peer bullying are also examples of adverse childhood experiences that we know have impacts across the lifespan. And so as we take the framework of approach for our work, we look at ACEs. We also notice that when we kind of think about our local context, we looked at the priority areas in Wake County after the most recent needs assessment was done within the county. And we see in terms of the top 10 areas that were most important to residents of Wake County, assistance kind of thinking about mental health and substance use disorders, housing and homelessness, and then issues with education and lifelong learning were all things that residents said rose to the top of some of the things that we should be prioritizing in Wake County. And so in addition to the work being really helpful to the families that we're serving at the Rehabilitation Center, we think that this work has broader implications for families in the local context, because these are things that are being experienced in our community. Next slide. Yeah. And so as we kind of think about, again, just giving some more statistics and background information, issues with parental incarceration really drive this work. So we see that there are estimated to be around 5 million children in the U.S. who have at least one parent behind bars. Many of those children, 1 in 8, are children that would be identified as living below the federal poverty line. 1 in 9 of those children are children that would be racially and ethnically identified as Black. And as we kind of think about the context of all that's going on with issues of systemic racism right now and the effects of that on children and families, we think it's really important for us to come to the table with some solutions that will be able to help fathers and families to talk about how these various traumas, so traumatization as a result of incarceration, as well as thinking of the intersection of incarceration and race. How are these things impacting children, and how can fathers and families best support their children as we deal with these day-to-day issues? Another issue that would be pretty important, and I'll go through this one kind of quickly, but thinking about substance use disorders. And so this slide is data that was collected by SAMHSA between, it's representing the outcomes between 2009 and 2014. And so when we look at all children in the United States, we see that starting very early, children are living in households where parents are impacted by substance use disorder. So from birth to age 17, we see that rate of those children that live in a household with at least one parent who has a substance use disorder within the past year ranges anywhere from 11.8% of children to 12.8% of children within that 0 to 17 category. One thing that I like to point out at the bottom part of this screen, so when we look at these tan bars, this really shows us the breakdown of how many parents are living in the household. So whether or not a child has 2 parents, 1 parent, a mother, or a father. And something that sticks out when we look at children that are living in the household that is a father-led household, we see that 11.8% of those children have a father a single father, who is impacted by substance use disorder. And that's not something that is broadly talked about. And so as a fatherhood scholar, I could say to you all that looking at issues that are faced by single fathers or the supports that single fathers might need is something that is now on the rise. And I think that this is an area that particularly can be important for us to think about, how do we support single father-headed households.
So I want to take a moment. We don't know the background of the attendees, but I want to take a moment and actually have you consider what is family literacy and what kinds of family literacy programs have you been involved with, or have you experienced, or are you aware of? And you know, really thinking about the way that family literacy is approached and what the goals and outcomes are, if possible. And I wonder if anybody has an answer to that, maybe they could put in the chat. We can take a few minutes to see like what your experiences have been with family literacy. And I'm not actually sure if I can see how the chat when people type messages.
We're checking.
Okay.
While we're waiting on that, I have a question. Are you seeing a difference between
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Can you unmute everybody, Elizabeth? I can, it seems like
I think we lost Terrance.
Angela, and are you there?
Hello, I'm back. I guess my mic went muted while I was talking. I think I'm not sure.
Can Angela, can you and Qiana hear us?
They are muted.
Can you unmute everybody? Let's let everybody talk.
Yes.
Now I'm unmuted. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can everybody, we're trying to unmute everybody. We don't have a huge audience, and I think it's important that people have a chance to speak. If you would like to speak and say your name and answer some questions or ask some questions, we're going to give everybody opportunity to do that.
So if you're an attendee, you can type a question or a chat in the chat box. Unfortunately, we can't unmute you.
Well, shucks.
So I had wondered if people had experience with family literacy, and what I can do is go to the next slide, and if somebody has an idea that they would like to chat, go ahead, or add to the chat, go ahead and do that. What I wanted to show you, which I think is really interesting, is when you do a Google search of family literacy, these are some of the images that pop up, and they reflect certain notions around family literacy that really center around a parent and a child, and a parent and child together. Usually these family literacy programs focus on a night where there's reading. A lot of times you come to the school and you have different activities and books are celebrated. There's also a lot of connotations here that connect with academic success, that families read together, succeed together, and the idea of teaching parents or children. And when we look at educational policy, this also connects with this as well, in that it defines family literacy as literacy practices that guardians and children engage in, and it also includes programs or interventions that enhance their life skills. But one of the things that we really want to think about is the fact that this is a very narrow understanding of family literacy, and it's a very narrow recognition of what it means to be a family. When we think that families are shaped by many factors such as culture, social class, race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and language practices, that results in very complex interactions and varied interaction. And so we really want to recognize that not all families look the way that they're being portrayed, and also not all families work in the way that family literacy programs are set up to address. For example, in some families, siblings are really significant, but we don't see that when we get these images of parent and child. And siblings can influence the literacy practices and literacy learning of each other. Children often take more responsibilities. They can even act as gatekeepers for their parents' involvement. So I found that in another project that I did. And even though a lot of the invitations for family literacy programs go to the parent, when I worked with middle school kids, they were really the ones that were controlling whether their parents found out information and whether they attended or not. And there's also the notion that family literacy programs can result in reciprocal benefits, so that there can be, benefits to both the father and the parent and the child, or the guardian and the child. And there's very little emphasis on the social and emotional connections through literacy practices when there's a larger focus on the academics. So the bottom line here, one of the things that we think is really important is that family literacy programs do not reflect the complexity of family structures at all the time. I mean, I'm not saying none of them, but many of the family literacy programs do not reflect those complexities, and there's different structures are needed in program development, and that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about. So when we go to some of the information that Qiana presented, specifically family literacy programs that address trauma, resulting from the separation due to substance use abuse and or incarceration or homelessness are limited. But the few studies that do exist show that programs that entail reading and writing, it can support families as they build relationships and even as they transition back into each other's lives or transition to different points of functioning, so that maybe they're in homes or working things out to where they are transitioning out of prison. So these are really important things to understand, that there is a lack of knowledge about how family literacy, or even how to design family literacy to accommodate such complexities that families face. But we know that there's some potential for healing and support if programs are designed in the right way. And when we think about the fact that there's very little to address families that are separated, there's other reasons that families are separated beyond substance use abuse, substance use disorder, and the other ones that I list, for example, military service, divorce, economic, work and professional reasons, immigration, kinship cares, and refugee status. So all of these are things that I think we need to really consider to expand out. So there's yours, Qiana.
Yeah, so as we think about some of the issues that Angela just noted, I want to make the point that it's important that as we think about father involvement, that we also consider the idea that a father not living in the household with his children does not equal father absence, and does not equal a father-child relationship that is not involved and supported. So a lot of my work looks at the role of non-resident fathers, and there are a few reports, one in particular that was published in 2013, that really highlights the role that non-resident fathers play in the lives of their children. So as we think about things like daily activities, such as bathing, such as completing homework, reading, feeding, things of that nature, we see that non-resident fathers are starting to take on those roles, or we at least are seeing it in the data more often. And as we think about father involvement, talking about it as a multidimensional construct is very important. So it's not just, how often a father sees his child, but really thinking about the quality of that engagement, thinking about how accessible the dad is to the child outside of the context of the home. We have several fathers who participated in the book sessions that even though they are physically separated, they talk about the importance of using technology as a way of staying connected to their children. We had one dad in the last session that talks a lot about using video game technology. So being on the headset with his child who lived several states away was really important as a way of him being able to stay connected and stay responsive to his child's needs. So really want to drive in this point that father residence does not equal father involvement, and that father involvement really is a multidimensional construct that looks at access, responsibility, engagement, and really kind of thinking about fathers taking on roles as nurturers and not only primary financial responsibility, or kind of thinking about the traditional disciplinary structure that father involvement has been measured by.
So to add to that, one of the important things of our own work is to develop responsive programs. We feel that programs and institutions can push back against the negative stereotypes of people who have experienced substance use disorder and homelessness, and just generally even the role of the fathers, which is overlooked. And we think that a responsive program that really takes into account the strengths that parents or guardians bring can lead to healing and support, particularly if they're led by parent needs and they take a strengths-based approach and are flexible in the way that they accommodate the needs of the families. So this is kind of where we're at when we are designing our own family literacy program. But then we have the other component, which is reading and responding to literature. And we want to just say that that's a social practice that provides people with opportunities to imagine a different life, to explore new experiences, and consider their past. So we use picture books because they're complex. They include both visual and textual components, and that expands the options that readers have for understanding and meaning making. And the fathers that we work with have children that are elementary school age. So the intention is that they're going to eventually read the picture books with their children. But what's interesting is they surprise themselves, and us actually, how with their own complex responses. And they always say, you know, we didn't think that when we'd come and sit down and read children's books with you that we would end up talking about some of these thoughts and feelings that we have about our children. And so we use literature as a springboard for being responsive to them and understanding their needs. And I want to tell you a little bit more about that. So just to kind of tell you a little bit about the context of our family literacy program and explain how we organize it and implement it, is we have book club sessions. So the fathers voluntarily choose to be a part of our family literacy program, and it's basically a book club of 8 to 10 fathers, and we've done it several times with mothers as well. And they commit to 6 sessions with us. The sessions are about 2 hours long. And what we do is we start off and we read a book together, and we use this. The book is, the discussion around the book gives us a lot of information and provides us with structure and ideas for how we plan in the moment and also for future sessions. So here's an example. We start off by introducing the book. So one of the books that we use is what I showed before. It's the book, A Chair for My Mother, which is actually a story about a mother who lives with her daughter, and they have a fire in their house and they have to rebuild. And one of the most important things is the mother doesn't have a place to sit. So they start saving all their money until they can get a chair for the mother. Many of you may know this book. It's an oldie but a goodie. It's a classic text. I think it was possibly published in the 70s. It's a Caldecott honor book, and it's got beautiful illustrations. It's by Vera B. Williams. So when we do our family literacy program, we start by introducing the book. We tell them a little bit of background, kind of like what I just did with you. And then we start to read it together. From there, we have open-ended discussion questions. So these are some examples of questions we might ask them. Like I said, we try to keep it open-ended so they can really think about how they're feeling in the moment and their impressions and how the book relates to them. So what picture in the book is your favorite and why? Describe the characters. What can you infer about the family's circumstances? What does the big jar represent or symbolize to the family? And are you hopeful about their future? And then even focusing on the colors in the story. We also, oh, go ahead, Qiana, that's yours.
Oh, and so one of the things that we initially start out with after we go through those discussion questions, we really try to hone in on what reading with their children looks like or feels like, or their hopes and aspirations for that shared reading time together. So we'll ask questions around what would you have done with the questions, or if your child had answered a question in a certain way. Is there anything that makes you feel safe about this particular book? Does it jog any memories as it relates to your own childhood? Something I find interesting, that over time, we don't have to carve out a particular set of space or a particular time in the session to ask this set of questions, because dads will begin to integrate those stories into their responses to the initial questions. When we read A Chair for My Mother, and I can say with over the 3 groups that we've done this, dads always point out the fact that the father is missing from this particular story. So if you're familiar with this book, you know that there's never any mention of the little girl's father or grandfather. There is an uncle that shows up at one point in time to like help move some furniture. But we always have several dads in the groups that say, well, I was really struck by the fact that there was no mention of the father here. And so this idea of kind of thinking about missingness or not being involved or not being thought of and represented in the picture books is something that's important and that we discuss. And so as a result of kind of thinking through, next slide, thinking through some of those issues, we try to make sure that in each session we have some psychoeducational tool that helps fathers to integrate some of those feelings and to be able to make a plan. And so that plan of action could be something that is passive, such as them journaling and kind of keeping track of what their feelings might be and what a potential plan could be for the future. Or it could be something that's active, such as, you know, planning or having a phone call with their child's caregiver or mother to kind of talk through some of these issues. And so we're presenting here a co-parenting framework, because oftentimes when we read this book, fathers start to have discussions or reflections around the nature of the parenting or co-parenting relationship with their child's caretaker. And so I like to present this co-parenting framework to fathers. We also give them a co-parenting measure that they can take so they can assess the nature of their relationship between themselves and the caregiver and kind of make a targeted plan for what they would like to approach in that conversation. And so we kind of talk about undermining. Is this something that occurs in your co-parenting relationship where the caregiver may contradict decisions that a father has about the child, or if they find that the caregiver is making negative comments about the father's parenting style? How would you approach that? And so we often bring in tools. One thing that fathers have liked, I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the All Pro Dads website, but they have conversation starters and conversation stoppers. And so we're able to talk with dads to say, well, when you approach this conversation, perhaps don't start with, you know, this language, maybe start it in this way to best open up the lines of communication, such that it doesn't feel like it's blaming and you're someone that's not there every day and, you know, can't necessarily make that decision. So we have conversations like that, and dads are able to make those connections and kind of think about how they could best apply what it is they learned from the book to their relationships with their children as well as the children's caregivers. And so as we, in the spirit of, again, being very responsive to the father's needs, so nothing for us without us, taking that approach, we wrap up every session in terms of talking to the dads about, well, these were the goals that we identified for this session, and asking them, what things did you find helpful? So was there anything that we did today that you felt supported by, or, you know, supported you on your fatherhood journey? And is there anything that you would like for us to do in the future that could support you in a more efficient manner? And so in that, dads are able to help us to select the book that will be used in the next session. So we, in terms of kind of thinking about our approach, it's not manualized in the way that we say, these are the books that, you know, have to be read. We really want to be responsive to fathers' needs in terms of what issues the dads in each group are facing at that particular point in time.
So it's actually one of the joys that Qiana and I have is stopping after or reflecting after we've done a family literacy session and thinking, okay, there's so many great books in the world. So what books will we use next? And that's always kind of an exciting thing to think about what they're sharing and how different books might address the needs for their next session. So our planning is iterative in that we really listen to what they need, and we really think about what they've discussed in the sessions, and from there we go to the next step. So we're building the program every single time that we meet with them. So we have a few books that are some of our favorites and some of their favorites. There's so many books, but just to show you some examples, and one thing, if you haven't had experience with reading a lot of children's picture books, you would be just amazed and surprised at how they have such beautiful drawings and complex ideas. So these are three that we use quite a bit. One is called Drawn Together. It's a story about a young boy visiting his grandfather. They speak different languages, but they find common ground when they learn that they both love to draw, and they both love art, and the storytelling flows from visual pictures. And this one is an amazing book because it has very little text, but the images are very complex, and the fathers find themselves lingering over the pages and really analyzing and thinking about barriers that they have with their children and things that could possibly or do connect them despite their distances. The next one is New Kid. This is a graphic novel. Sometimes we'll have groups that have kids that are a little bit older. So we try to bring in graphic novels that might be appealing to upper elementary and middle school kids. This is a story about Jordan Banks. He goes to a private school where he's one of the few children of color. He learns to navigate microaggressions of the school culture, but is also challenged to fit in with his neighborhood friends. So it's a really important conversation, you know, about microaggressions and racism, but also fitting in and being accepted. So those are some really important topics that come from that. And then another one, Going Down Home with Daddy, where the dad takes his family down home to see his granny's house, and he has time with extended family and hears the stories of his ancestors. And this is one where Qiana has guided them to really think about their family and how different patterns have evolved from their family histories from a health perspective. You want to say something about that, Qiana?
Yeah, I would say if there are any social workers on the line and you're familiar with using genograms as a tool to map intergenerational dynamics, this book is a great starting point for an exercise like that. And so we've used this with dads to read the story. The visuals in this book are excellent. And then ask the fathers to create a 3-generation genogram to really kind of reflect on some of those issues. 2 other books that I really enjoy that we don't have included here, but as we kind of think about some of the traumas that we talked about earlier, After the Fall by Dan Santat is a book that fathers who are really kind of thinking through their issues with substance use disorder have found pretty helpful in terms of thinking about what that journey looks like over time, and how you can be triumphant. And then also The Day You Begin by Jacqueline Woodson, in terms of kind of thinking about how do you talk to your child about the fact that they may not be the only child experiencing a particular issue at a time. And so really kind of dispelling stereotypes, I think have been also helpful books.
And I want to mention too that After the Fall was written by Dan Santat to really talk about his wife's struggle with mental illness. And even though it's a book that could be read with young children, the symbolism is very deep. And that's one of the things that they really can connect with, some of the images and descriptions in there. So to kind of wrap up, what we'd like to do is share some of the things that we're seeing in these in our family literacy sessions. And so one of the really important things is that the fathers use the time to respond to literature, and we give them time to write in their journal and sketch out visual images. And they use this time of responding to literature and also journaling and sketching out images to reflect on their relationships with children. And this was one that was very powerful. This father drew this picture after he had talked about being disconnected and figuring out where he fits in, but also recognizing that he had been in a situation where he and his partner were not getting along well, and it affected his child. And as a result, they had a strained relationship, both with the partner, the ex-partner now, and also with the child. And so what he did is he started a journal during our sessions and wrote to his daughter every day, even though he wasn't in touch with her. And as we were involved with the program and involved with him, we saw that their relationship was starting to progress. So he hadn't sent her journal, after several months and us checking in, he hadn't sent his journal to her yet, but they were starting to have phone calls. But this was kind of the starting point of him saying, I have to accept responsibility for what happened, and I have to understand that she's going to be upset and it's going to take time for healing. So this is one thing, they take this opportunity to reflect on the relationships with the children. They also are able to articulate regrets and reconciliation. And an important thing that they say is that when they're in the residential treatment, they do definitely focus on their recovery, but they don't always have spaces to talk about parenting. And so, they share things like you know, I never had the intent to be apart from my child. My actions are not intentions, and that's where I am because I still make mistakes every day. So really thinking about those regrets and really thinking about what it's going to be like when they are back together again.
Yeah, and so as we think about, again, as Angela said, we have this activity at the end of each group where fathers are able to reflect on what they were able to take away from that session. Some of them really talk about this idea of what their hope is for the future. And so you see two images here that were drawn by a dad in the group. And so when he reflected, I just drew a basic picture of me on the side. It's supposed to kind of look like a heart, and a heart on this side and my son on the bottom, like peeking through and smiling. It says to me, harmony. That's co-parenting. The peaceful lines in our eyes, we're relaxed and nobody's tripping. So really just having this space to think about like what their ideal relationship with both co-parents as well as their children might look like as a result of what we've discussed in the session.
So we really want to leave with you the idea that practitioners and researchers should consider the notion of expanding how we consider family for program development and scholarly research. And we also want to encourage programs and institutions to push back against negative stereotypes of people who've experienced homelessness and drug addiction to provide opportunities for healing and support. And advocate for the idea of leading programs, having parent needs lead the programs, taking a strength-based approach, and being flexible to accommodate needs of families. So we support the notion of removing binaries, either they're involved or they're not, or they live together or they don't, and exploring needs of communities where programs and learning are taking place. So when Qiana and I started planning this webinar, we said there's no way that we're going to fill the time that we were thinking of. But now we're at the end of our session and of our presentation, and looking forward to the questions and comments that you have. So now we get to turn it over to you for your questions, and want to say thank you very much for listening to our presentation and being involved.
Well, thank you both for your wonderful presentation. There are amazing people on the line. We have someone from Rocky Mount Prep who has a wonderful principal there, Dr. Garrett, and she just wanted to let you know that they have family night reading that focus on 5 components of reading and different activities, and we've seen many different comments from there. But one good question that I've seen was, how many fathers that you engage with had past tense fathers who read to them?
And that's not something that we have formally assessed, but as the sessions go on, particularly the one where we read Going Down Home with Daddy, we find that actually many of the fathers in our group have strained relationships or had strained relationships with their fathers during childhood, and some of them still currently trying to figure those relationships out. So Angela, I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. One of the things that's interesting is that there's a range of parents or fathers who have had, their parents are not experiencing substance use, and some of them do. And so it is, sometimes we see that it's cyclical and sometimes not, but that doesn't have anything to do with reading together. But I think that's a question we should explore more. It'd be really interesting.
Yeah.
And then we have a hooray for Kelly Starling Lawrence, and they said that their school or their PTA had the school writer come and speak to the different kids at the school. But I had another question come in that spoke to some statistics that Qiana mentioned earlier, Dr. Coupet mentioned earlier. What are some of the popular, either accurate or inaccurate cultural stigmas have you discovered around mental health and academic performance with Black fathers or in Black and Brown communities?
I would say the idea of not being involved as we kind of think about academic performance. The report that I mentioned earlier by Jones and Mosher, it's published in 2013, is the report that really looked at how non-resident fathers are involved in their children's lives, and again, looking at daily tasks or day-to-day activities. And that was one of the first published reports where we saw that African American fathers, or Black fathers, it's identified using census data, were actually engaged at levels higher than fathers of any other ethnicities when we looked at their engagement in day-to-day tasks. And so when that report was initially published, there was some kind of media picking up of that, but I don't think that it has been broadly disseminated in that way. And so that's one report that I point to. If you, whoever asked that question, if you want to email me, I'll be happy to share a copy of that article with you. Also, some of the work that colleagues and I have been doing using the Fragile Families data set. And so for those who are not familiar with Fragile Families, it's a large longitudinal data set that has followed about 5,000 families from the time the child was born to the children are currently about age 15 in that data set. And so over the course of those 15 years, there have been several fathers who have experienced bouts with incarceration. And so when we think about particularly Black fathers and those who've been incarcerated, folks may say, well, you don't necessarily have the capacity to be involved in your child's educational experiences or outcomes. So we published a paper last year that suggested that those fathers were working to co-parent with the mothers. And as we look at the interactions between mothers and fathers, fathers did actually have a significant impact on their sons' early literacy skills and reading skills. And so those dads were trying to be creative or intentional in terms of thinking about how they were co-parenting and really being active in a way that would impact their literacy outcomes. There's also some qualitative work that has looked at non-resident and resident African American fathers to really look at or to interrogate how they plan to instill values in their sons, as well as kind of thinking about what's important for them in terms of their disciplinary practices and their parenting practices. And so I would say a stereotype is that Black dads are not involved, and we're seeing more and more, particularly within the last 7 years or so, that scholars are listening to, interviewing, talking to Black fathers and getting information about how they are actually involved. And folks are beginning, Marquita Dorsey is a scholar at Loyola University. She's really working now to highlight the relationship between Black fathers and their daughters, because we see the work that has been done thus far has primarily focused on Black fathers and sons. And so those shifts are occurring. But again, if you want to email me, I can share some of that work with you if you would find that helpful too.
And Qiana, I want to say that if to all our guests, if we're going to be, you'll be getting a thank you email back. Thank you for attending the webinar. And Qiana and Angela, if you have any of those things, if you want to give them to, send them to me, we'll make sure that all those links and references are in our follow-up email that goes to not just the folks that registered tonight, but some of the folks who said they couldn't make it at the last minute. So I also can do that for you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
So Yvonne, do we have more time for questions?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so we have a couple more in here. One is in reference to the location of your programs. One person wanted to know your reading literacy programs, are they available in the Raleigh area? I believe that was the question.
So I was going to say our program is a community partnership in one place right now. We have talked about expanding. However, it's really just Qiana and me, and sometimes a few grad students. So it's not like a kind of a program that could be scheduled at this point. Yeah, I don't know, Qiana, if you have anything else to say about that.
Yeah, we've been working, as we mentioned, the workshop that we held earlier this past spring semester, working to try to train graduate students in the model that we've developed with the hope that they take what they can from it and try to implement pieces that may be helpful in their field placement or in spaces where they are student teaching. So I think that there could also be some opportunity for us to kind of talk about how folks are able to develop this model in a way that best suits your particular school or community setting.
We have two of the same question, one from Beverly and one from Kate. It references work with incarcerated fathers, and one just wanted to know, was there any research or have you engaged fathers at all, maybe reading to their children by phone? Then the other question was referencing fathers and children during visitation, not having access to books during that trip. Have you seen any engagement between children and incarcerated fathers?
Yes, I would
So,
say.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
I was just going to give a resource. Dr. Brandon McLeod at the University of Illinois at Chicago, he is starting to do some work and published a paper last year, which I can also add to the list, that looked at different forms of visitation for incarcerated fathers as a way of improving engagement in this way. So really highlighting the importance of teleconferencing options. So in Chicago, there has been some work done with the Cook County Jail where caregivers and children were able to visit via video conference, so that, you know, the cost of going there or the detailed amount of time and checks and all those things that have to happen didn't necessarily have to occur. And so that's one way. And I can say, as a graduate student, I worked on a project. It took a long time to really facilitate that level of engagement, but it was really helpful once we were able to do that. And so I think looking at different methods of engaging in that way. And I know that there are a few programs. So Inside Out Dad is one parenting program that's been used in jails and prisons to help dads to kind of think about their parenting skills and what they want to accomplish post-release. But that is not a program that really engages children in that way. But there are some models, and I think Angela might talk about one in North Carolina.
Right. So I was going to say, we actually started out collaborating with Mother Read, which is a local nonprofit organization, and they do train people in using children's literature. It's geared towards going into prisons and working with parents and guardians who are incarcerated. So that was kind of our starting point. And we've since modified quite a bit, but they're an excellent resource. So that is one option that you might want to look at if you were wanting to connect with local resources. The other one that I'd like to talk about is called Our Children's Place, and it's headed by Melissa Radcliffe, and she works with families that are incarcerated and also organizes family days at different prisons. I've worked with her at the Orange County Correctional Facility to organize a family day for fathers and their children. And so those are two other things, and we can include those in the resources that we send out to you.
Okay, and Christina Rush said that she would love the articles. I think Dr. Coupet mentioned in her statement, but we have a question in reference to research on adverse effects on girls when the mother is absent from the homes, or the level of engagement, and connected to that same question around the adverse effects on girls with mother absence is, do you see a difference between the needs of a single father and the needs of a single mother?
So I will say that I'm not well versed in that area of the literature. And in terms of kind of thinking about single fathers, that's a very new area. And the comparisons are typically made between single fathers and fathers who are parenting either as a non-resident father or a father that is married. So I have not seen much in that way, but I can do a little research to better answer that question for the slide that will come out later. But I'm not familiar enough to answer that.
We can talk though, and Qiana, you and I were talking about this today, about the differences we saw with the fathers we worked with in the residential treatment and the mothers. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest things that is problematic, and I don't think it's just specific to the place that we have been working with, is that it's much easier for the mothers to have access to the children. And the spaces even look very different. With the mother's facility has a room that's very homey with books and crayons and games and things like that. And the fathers have kind of a conference room space. And it's, you know, it's those kinds of things where that reflects a larger issue of programs and materials and research that really looks at the maternal factor as far as support for the mother, and not as much with the father. And that's how I started working with the fathers in the first place. I started working with the mothers initially, and the community partner that we work with at the facility said the dads are who really needs this, because we find that there's a lot of people that want to work with the mothers, and they don't want to put the same resources to the fathers. So I shifted my work based on that need.
Yeah, and I think if we think about it in that way as well, the responsibility that's often on the mother. So facility that we work with, mothers are able to have their children come and do weekend visits or overnights, whereas that's not allowed for fathers. And so oftentimes kind of thinking about what the stresses of parenting while in recovery look like, they are very different for mothers and fathers in that way. But we don't have any data on the impact of the children or impact on the children. Yeah.
I appreciate. We have Elizabeth. She is a media. She works in the media center at an elementary school, and she wanted to know what's the best way that her and her school can engage Black and Brown communities and parents to participate more in the programs that they offer. What advice do you have?
So I would say I've not worked in an elementary school setting, but I have a first grader. And one of the things as a parent that sometimes frustrates me is that in terms of thinking about programming, making sure that you're intentional about being, in terms of offering diverse times and settings for activities. So if activities are only offered during the school day, then you're gonna not capture some parents who are working during the school day. So perhaps varying the times in which things are offered. Also making sure that folks feel like they're seen in the literature that you're presenting in those programs. So, you know, the faces, the stories, that they are diverse and not just necessarily always about the civil rights movement, but kind of thinking about what are day-to-day activities that children of diverse backgrounds, and so again, as we're kind of speaking in the context of Black and Brown children, that it's not always about how to overcome being different, but what about joyous activities? So day-to-day, you know, what is it like to play on the playground? Or there's a book, I can't think of the name of it right now, I don't have, but my son really likes it. It's called like Playing the Blues or something like that, but it really kind of takes you through the day in the life of a little boy who aspires to be a jazz musician. So those would be my perspectives as a parent, making sure that there's a diversity in the times that programs are offered, as well as thinking about having a diverse array of books that highlight different daily activities and not always focused on, say, for instance, the civil rights movement.
And just to add to that, I think one of the most important things to do is partner with the community. One thing is that if you can have collaborative relationships with community members, they're going to appeal and interest and connect with different segments of the community of the school. So when I lived in the DC area, a teacher was partnering with a community member at a homeless shelter. And as a result, when they developed literacy events at the school, which for them were poetry coffee houses, there were all different kinds of families that showed up because they had different relationships and connections to different people that were involved. And the community member knew the families really well and knew what they were interested in doing, and also encouraged them because they were going into the shelter. So that's one thing. I had another point. Let me think for a second.
Well, I'll jump in there and say as well, don't automatically assume that lack of participation in the programming as it's currently presented, that means that the families are not interested in their children's educational outcomes. And so just to kind of piggyback off of Angela's point of kind of working with community, also making sure that parents feel like they have a voice in the planning of those particular activities, because it could be that they're just things that are occurring. So maybe the activities don't always have to happen in the school space. Perhaps there are community spaces that are more convenient or feel more comfortable to parents to interact in, that might be helpful in terms of thinking about attendance.
That really helped me think about my other point, because one of the things that we have to understand is that families who have been marginalized for different reasons have felt that from their schools. So it's a different story for some people to feel like, oh, I've got an invitation to school. If you did not feel like you were welcomed at school and you did not have a positive learning experience, that's not going to be something that you want to do, is go to school with your kids. And I think we also have to recognize, like Qiana said, that involvement happens in a lot of different ways. These can be culturally mediated. So certain families, it's more important for them to sit at the table and talk about learning and what they're reading than it is to actually go into the schools. And then it's also further complicated by work contexts and their schedules. So I think it's, you really think about the intersectionality of your identity, your culture, and your educational experiences. And so an invitation to come read a book at a school can be a really complex thing to navigate.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Terrance, I know you're going to say the same thing I was going to say, which is about, we do a workshop. Terrance and I have done a workshop on how PTAs can be more trauma informed, how parents can be more trauma informed, and all the points you're making. I'm proud to say we have those in one of our fact sheets, don't we, Terrance? And we talk about how it is really important in terms of being trauma informed to understand that it's important to reach parents in many, many different ways, and not to, and your point about the meetings, Qiana, is really important. We've had a lot of parents tell us the only way that they can participate in something would be if it was first thing in the morning, because they work the night shift. We've had other parents tell us that they don't get off until 3:30 or 4, and they have to pick up their kids, and they can't pick up their kids and get home and turn around and come back, or they don't have transportation. And so when we've talked to parents, they've said, do have meetings different times of the day, have meetings, some that are virtual, have some meetings that are recorded for presentations or programs, and we can listen to them on our phone later. If you have a parent education meeting, it doesn't have to always be that we're sitting in a seat in the auditorium. And one of the recommendations we've got one time is that, maybe having a school book club, where as much as possible you provide a book for every family that they read at home with their family. And that's the parent education thing, to read the book together and to talk about it. So we've heard a lot of different things, and you're spot on with your comments.
And I wanted to highlight another question as well that focuses on the type of books that you've listed. What we see is a diverse group of people in the illustrations. Is this deliberate in your literacy strategy, and where are you finding your books, and what stores?
So I am a children's literature scholar, and whether it's, I guess, I'm always deliberate in having diverse people, diverse children, diverse characters in my books, because I think that's really important. And so as far as where I find the lists, I used to edit the Journal of Children's Literature, which is one of the outlets for research on children's literature, and our focus was books that represent diverse characters. And if you follow the hashtag "We Need Diverse Books," we know that this is really important in education and in just in representation. But these also are really high quality books. They win awards and they're just amazing. So I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question.
No, you're right. I mean, I'm not sure of the person who asked it, but it seemed to address it to me, and it leads to the next question. Of the books that's selected, do you see a particular type of conversation that's birthed between the father or the parent and their child?
Yeah, I definitely think it. Yeah, I was going to say I definitely think it depends on what book we're reading and when. And I'll go back to the example of Going Down Home with Daddy. I think that book was able to spark some intergenerational conversations. So in our last session in the fall, when dads came back to kind of talk about that book, there was conversation. There was one dad in particular who kind of said, I've never really talked to my son about my relationship with my own father. And so this was one of the first books where we saw the focus on like intergenerational dynamics in that way. And he talked about some of the complications of potentially starting this conversation with his son. It also led him into a space of kind of talking about his child's mother and her family background. And so the dad developed a plan for starting that conversation with his partner about how do we talk about both sides of this family and start to kind of introduce some of the cultural norms as well as some of the issues that our families individually have faced and how it might impact that son. So we don't ever specifically ask those questions, but dads pull it out of each other. And that's one thing that I really enjoy about this work is the camaraderie amongst those fathers. And so I would say one thing that might be different in community, if you have a group of fathers who don't know each other in the same ways that a group of dads who are living in residential treatment come to know each other because they've been in other groups, the depth of the discussion and the conversation might be a little different. But I think that the dads in our group really begin to push each other to kind of think about how these things might show up in their lives.
And so the last question that I have, and I'll hand it over to Yvonne, is what has been the longest relationship of a single father in your program?
Oh, the longest romance? Oh, yeah. So we don't, one of the things that we have tried to be intentional about is not collecting too much data in a way that might be invasive and kind of be off-putting to fathers. So really focusing on building the relational skills. So we work with a family engagement specialist who has collected data about the fathers and their families prior to entering the group. So if ever we would need that information to inform group work, we could have access to it. But we really have not interrogated in that way. So we couldn't say for sure what the longest relationship. We had a dad in one of the groups though that talked about the fact he was an older father. So we've, in terms of kind of thinking about the ages of the dads who participated, they've ranged anywhere from 23 years old to 63 years old. And we've had a dad to really talk about the idea of how he's had negative relationships with several of the mothers of his children and how that impacts his relationship with his children. But Angela, I don't know if you want to say more. I don't think we have specific data in that way.
Exactly. Just that there is such a wide range of experiences with the fathers that we've worked with. We've had some that have been with their family for a longer time and even are still with partners. And we have a lot of them are separated from partners, but have had different experiences with them. And you're right, we don't really get into that with them because we're really focused on their relationship with their children and thinking about how we can assist them and support them as they really consider ways to engage with their children.
Yeah.
Well, that is, I'm going to wrap things up now so that we can let folks get back to their busy evening. And I cannot tell. Can you see my screen now and see our website?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I cannot tell you how really wonderful this evening has been. I have learned a tremendous amount from both of you. I look forward to the articles you're going to send me so we share them with everyone. I do want to say that one of the questions that someone texted me just now, who's on the line, wants to know if you have any advice right now for reading that would help parents with conversations either around COVID or around the issues that are going on right now in our community and across the nation over the death of George Floyd. I know that's not quite what you signed up for tonight, but if you have any suggestions for any reading and you want to send it to me later, we can include it in our email to folks. But they're saying, you know, that they love the way that you are using books to have conversations that lead to other conversations, and they're just wondering if you have some advice with all your experience in literary publications that you could point us to some places that parents could use right now.
Yvonne, I'd love to share that. I've actually been working with a blog from the Children's Literature Assembly, and I wrote one myself about resources for COVID, and we definitely have had some about addressing racism, and I'll send those out as well. But yes, thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Yeah, and I will also say, as a parent to a 4- and 7-year-old, the 2 books that I'm reading with my kids right now to kind of talk about issues around discrimination and racism: Dreamers by Yuyi Morales and Drum Dream Girl by Margarita Engel have been helpful to start those conversations about difference and racism in our household. So
look, I'm telling you right now, for our guests and for myself and for Terrance, please send us all these suggestions in an email. I'll compile it together and we'll have it sent out to all of our attendees today so they can share this rich resources. I want to say, and as a former social worker, I'm really so inspired by the work that you're doing with fathers. You know, the old model of working with families that I had experience with is visiting the mother, who was almost always the custodial parent, and working with the mother and really never having the time or the invitation or the training and the avenue to work with the absent father. And I think it's such a critical area of need for our family, for our children, for healthy children. So I'm just really inspired by your interest in this research, Qiana and Angela, the meeting of the 2 great minds that you all come together and using literacy as a way to heal wounds and create conversations is absolutely beautiful. I'm just really inspired by your work. I want to share with our guests that this is our website, Public Schools First NC. I hope you'll go and visit, because this whole conversation tonight, what got us to this workshop, was talking a lot about adverse childhood experiences and trauma and the ability for children and fathers and mothers to overcome the impact of trauma on their lives. And so we have a lot of really great resources here. And if you go to our website and look under resilience, there's a tremendous amount of information. And Qiana and Angela, we want to add a lot of your stuff to this website. So anything you send us, we will add it here. We have a lot of resources. If you click here, we also show the film Resilience, Paper Tigers, Broken Places. We've got some, Angela, starting reference here for COVID resources. We cannot wait to see what you can give us to add here. So we really want to encourage our audience to go a step further now and learn a lot more about trauma in families and how we can be a part of making that better. So as a last thing I'll say is I hope that all of you will excuse us for this internet situation tonight. We're so sorry we weren't able to share our webcams so you could see our our faces and interact with us in a different way. We appreciate that you were patient and stayed with us. We hear Elizabeth, who is our social media director, is telling me that this problem's been noted on Twitter, and she's been sending help desk tickets in, and we're not quite sure what happened. But I am telling you that if these two professors will come back sometime, we'd like to reschedule them again, and maybe later this summer, and have a extended conversation where we can get you more involved and more engaged. In the meantime, please stay connected with us. Like us on Facebook. Go to our, join our follow us on Twitter. We have a tremendous amount of wonderful webinars on our YouTube channel, and we would invite you to do that. Any last comments from you, Angela or Qiana or Dr. Ruth? Anything else y'all would like to add before we sign off?
I just want to thank everybody, Yvonne and Terrance. This was such a great experience. I'd love to come back and have a conversation with you and with the audience members where we can see each other. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, and I want to echo that and also highlight that June is Men's Health Awareness Month as well as Responsible Fatherhood Awareness Month. And so I want to commend everybody for taking the first step to come out today to start learning more about how we can support fathers and families. And if you follow our lab on Twitter at Whole Dad Lab, we'll be providing information all month on ways in which we can support dads in our community. So thank you all again.
Well, we are absolutely public schools first, and of course, all of me, Elizabeth, and Terrance, we're going to jump off this call tonight, and the first thing we're going to do is go follow you on, say that again.
It's Whole Dad Lab, and that's the Twitter handle.
Well, we're going to be doing that because there's so much that we need to learn, and thank you for sharing your talents with us. So we will absolutely get back with you later in the summer. We're going to let people finish up the elementary K through 12 years are getting ready to wrap up in a couple of weeks, and then perhaps we can all take a break, and then we'll come back and visit with you again. Thank you all for visiting with us tonight. Good night, and stay safe.
Thank you.